Hi everybody, my name is Jordan. I am the sessions manager for PixelPop. I've been here all day. I hope you've had a wonderful first day at PixelPop. Give this whole event a round of applause. Yeah, that's the energy I like. So every year at PixelPop, we end the first day with a series of Microtalks on experimental games. PixelPop likes to explore the idea that experimentation is the key to extending the limits of an art form. And with that, we have a few wonderful speakers that will come and express the things that they are doing to extend the art form of games. So with that said, I'd like to just get us immediately started and start with our first speaker, Catherine Brennan, with Making Games Make Me Feel Better. Catherine is a St. Louis native who loves creating and contributing. She develops games with a focus on creating calming, thoughtful experiences, runs a Gamerhood, gamerhood.org, a St. Louis-based community for game developers and marginalized genders, and works at noonlight.com, a connected safety company. Find out more about her at catherinebrennan.com, catherinepbrennan.com, I apologize. And with that, here's Catherine.
Hey everyone, welcome to my talk about why making games makes me feel better. So to get started, sort of to reiterate, my name is Catherine Brennan. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a software engineer at New Light by day. I also run Gamerhood, which is a group for people of marginalized genders, and I'm a game developer for myself. Now, what does that really mean? Essentially, the main reason that I make games is because it makes me feel better. There's tons of other reasons to make games, whether to learn, or to practice skills, or make money, but my primary goal right now is to just make myself feel good. So why does making games make me feel better? For one, it makes me feel very accomplished. The reason it makes me feel accomplished is because it helps me channel my urge to binge things. As I'm sure many of us do, I have a tendency to start doing something and hyper focus on it. And sometimes that can be TV or other less healthy habits. So by focusing on a game instead, I can sort of channel that urge to binge into something productive. Another way that it helps me feel better about myself is because it lessens my imposter syndrome. If you don't know what it is, it's essentially the idea that you feel like you don't belong or feel inadequate with what you're doing. And so making games makes me feel like I'm doing something. And for instance, I'm a software engineer full-time during the day, so I use Phaser, which is a JavaScript-based engine. That way I can sort of flex those JavaScript-based skills and be like, yeah, I'm a software engineer and I'm good at this. Another reason it makes me feel better is because it's a really good way to express myself. One of the ways I can express myself is through expressing different emotions and just sort of expressing things I've felt before or things that stress me out. An example of this is this game called Keeping It Together, where it sort of just looks like a bunch of like nuts on bolts doing crazy things, but it's meant to express this emotion of getting overwhelmed by things and sort of trying to stop all those pieces from falling apart and inevitably failing, but sort of showing that emotion and making other people feel that way. And then secondly, reflecting on experiences. So for instance, I like to travel a lot, but I also have a lot of passion about my hometown, which is St. Louis. And so this game is called Wander Where, and essentially lets you think more about going away or staying home. And then once you've collected your thoughts enough, you either go away or stay at home based on the thoughts that you've collected. Finally, it gives me a chance to explore ideas. So some of them might not be about an emotion or expressing old feelings, but it might just be like, oh, I have this cool idea. Let me just explore it for fun. One instance of this is my game Influence that I'm showing at the Gamerhood table. Essentially, I had an idea. I want to see what happened if I gave people an environment where they can either do the good thing or the bad thing and have everyone sort of affect the same world. And by doing that, I can just see like how people interact with it and see where it kind of all ends up. Another reason games makes me feel better is because it gives me a way to connect with others. One way is that it helps me find people like me. So for instance, during Train Jam this year, I made a game called Getting Together, where I essentially made a game about how me and my husband were in a long distance relationship for a long time. And that was very stressful and a hard thing to do. And so I had all this flavor text. And when I showed it to other people, I found people that had also been in long distance relationships that really connected with me and were like, oh, we had this shared experience. And so it made me feel less alone in the world. And another way is to strengthen relationships. This is a game that I made with my sister for a game jam. And we don't always get to spend time together, or we get busy with our lives. And so it gives us a chance to set time aside to spend that time with each other rather than sort of just doing our own thing all the time. All right, so I've talked about why making games makes me feel better. Now let me talk about how I make games in order to accomplish that goal. For one, I sort of set expectations, and there's a couple different ways to do this. For one, the one that you hear all the time is to have a small scope. And so sort of be like, okay, I want to do this thing, this small thing, and do it really well. An instance of this is Keep It Together. As you can see, it's very simple artwork. There's no like main screen or anything. It just fades in and out and then goes, and this is essentially the entire game. Another way is to just be okay with gradual progress and sort of doing like, yeah, I don't have to get this done right now. I can just sort of work on it as I want to. No big deal if it's not done right now. An example of this is going back to my game Influence that I'm showing. It's not like a huge game, but it's a little bit more complex. And so I've just been sort of poking away at it as I can for the past year or so. And finally, just also accepting that like, it doesn't have to be perfect. It's totally fine if it's just a game and exists, even if you never go back to it. You can just be like, oh, I made this cool thing. It is what it is, and hopefully it's fun. An example of this is, I don't know, I like really hate this thought bubble, but it's not a huge deal. I don't know if I'll ever go back to it, and it kind of works anyway, so it's all good. And sort of going on to that point, it's also really important to, instead of just worrying about setting expectations, is to go easy on myself and make sure I don't get like too mad at myself or like am way too hard on myself. And one way to do that is give myself internal pep talks. And so if I'm working on something and I'm like, oh man, like this sucks, I'm really bad at this, or it's not great, just being like, okay, Catherine, like you can do this is fine, this is totally normal, it's totally cool. And then when that fails and I'm getting super frustrated, it's also, as we know, important to take breaks, even if it's just switching to working on a different thing, or even like very briefly looking at Twitter. Maybe like don't do that too much, because sometimes that can, again, make the binge less productive. But again, just going easy on yourself and making sure you take breaks. Another way to sort of make sure you're getting the most out of it is to just get your games out there. This is like a hard thing to get used to, and it took me a while to get used to doing it. I really only started doing it within the past year or so. And the way I do it is, yes, you know, it's good to make money with games, but for me it would add too much stress, so sort of the point of it. And so that's not something I focus on right now. And that way too, I can sort of just like get the games out there and have people playing them and see how they react. And then another important thing is to take criticism, but also ignore haters. So just make sure that you're not focusing on too much on people that your game isn't for. Again, it's not for them, so if they don't enjoy it, it's not a huge deal. That was kind of the same point, keep your audience in mind. And finally, game jams. Game jams are a good way to set aside time, but also you have to be really careful about not going too crazy and like doing what other people want. So essentially, do game jams how you want to, take care of yourself, and do what works for you. And then that applies just like in general, this is what I do, but do whatever works for you. I'm by no means a professional. And so finally, thank you for watching my talk. Here's my contact information, and I'll be over at the neighborhood table tomorrow.
Oh, this is yours.
Oh, thanks. Sorry.
Sorry about that. Oops, sorry about that.
Try not to die up here. That's the thought.
Okay, and with that, we're going to move on to our next talk. Duck Hunt Dogma 95, designing experimental games under constraints with Jack Hart. Jack is a game designer making good game garbage, my favorite bio of the day. You can find their website at cybearpunk.com or follow them on Twitter at Jack of Heart.
All right, so this is Duck Hunt Dogma. Test 1, 2. All right. Like I said, Duck Hunt Dogma. It's a dogmatic approach to building rad games, and that is as far as we're going to talk about Duck Hunt for the rest of this talk. All right, so who am I? My name is Jack, my pronouns are they, them, and I'm an independent game designer based somewhere in the woods in Oregon, currently working on surrealist whale games. Yeah, shout out to whales. All right, so what is this talk? Okay, so about a year ago, a colleague and friend of mine, Elisa Bricker, who unfortunately can't be here today, wanted to make a set of constraints for making small experience games that pushed us creatively while also cut down on development time. So real quick, Lars von Trier, y'all, bad person. I'll be very brief with this, but I take a lot of direct inspiration in my approach to how I make games for how he made films in 1995, but he's not a great person, and I don't endorse him at all. Anyway. All right, so in 1995, Lars von Trier and Thomas Vinterberg were frustrated with how films were, thought they were all bad and stuff, whatever, and so they made the vow of chastity, a list of constraints around films to make what they thought would make better, true movies. These included really weird things, like you couldn't credit the director of your film, but also had a lot of really interesting stuff about how you light films and different types of cameras and film you actually used. So on one hand, it's like super tongue-in-cheek. On the other hand, they made 35 of these films. So, yeah. So albeit his shortcomings, we wanted to take that type of idea of creating all of these artificial constraints on making games to focus on just like the player experience and game aesthetic kind of above everything else. We wanted to create games with a singular focus. And that focus was that players should be able to walk away saying that the game made me feel blank. Whatever it is, whether it's laughing or being sad, that reducing the player experience to that singular focus completely narrows the scope of your game. And basically going through your mechanics and saying, does this mechanic fill it made me blank? And if it doesn't, throw it in the garbage. Also, making games is hard. So we were also creating a list that made just making games easier for us. That meant that we weren't going to be spending time and development resources on things that we weren't interested in. So here is the list of constraints we made. So first of all, 1 week, that just immediately put a time constraint on it. We had to make games in a week, boom, done. This allowed us to have a process where you can't self-doubt yourself because you don't have the time to sit here and rethink about like, oh, is this mechanic working? Is this fun? It needs to be what it is and you have to keep going. No text meant that if we put story into our game, we had to think about abstracting out what that meant and allowed us to kind of be creative and experiment with what having stories in games in. Also a really neat thing we found later was that it made all of our games have no language barrier, which was like a really neat side note. No new assets was my favorite thing. I'm super inspired by the B games of like, if you know, like Sexy Hiking and games in that caliber. And we wanted to make sure that we weren't hemming and hawing over asset creation. We're not asset artists. So if you can't like sit there and look at a pixel art, like a pixel sprite, and be like, oh, this doesn't look right if you don't have any. And you just have to like grab something and throw it onto the screen and hope that it works. And I'll actually show there's some really great examples on the differences of how we actually end up utilizing this. Meaningful sound. So we didn't want to do the thing that I felt like we were doing a lot in small game jams where it was like, oh, we only have another hour left and we need to add music, so it seems good. And so we wanted to, if we're going to add sound, it had to be meaningful and have to have like a standard, or not a standard, but a significant portion of the game towards it. And one camera and no camera movement in the game. This, once again, just allowed us to focus our scope. It meant that we had a canvas to work on, and we had to work inside of that canvas, and that just cut down on constraint, just cut down on the resources we needed again. And last, but again, most importantly, it made me feel blank. If something in your game doesn't fulfill that, throw it out. So here, I'm going to show 3 examples of games I made, and then I'm going to quickly go through the games that Elisa also made. So this is my game Phone Home. It's a game at communicating the stress I feel when I text my parents. Sending the right emojis lowers the stress of my parents while raising my stress. I'm the cog. And then not sending any emojis lowers the cog stress while increasing the stress of your parents. The game also included real voicemails from my parents. And so the aim of this was to make players feel super uneasy, actually adding like a real phone UI that people recognize, as well as just having people be like, my mom just be like, hey Jack, how's it going? Meant that it just made people's like skin crawl, because it was just like very real. And the game would just eventually crash out when the meter spilled over. This is Bad Tetris. Bad Tetris is a prime example of cutting down on resources. I built the original prototype in an hour. You just grab a Tetris from Git and a third-person character from Unity and smash them together. So you were using the controls of Tetris and the 3D little guy over there at the same time. So basically, rotating a Tetris piece also moved the character forward. Shifting a Tetris piece left and right rotated the character like tank controls. And Tetris hard dropping would make the character jump. And then line clearing in Tetris makes parts of the floor disappear. This is how I know I succeeded. This is the only comment on the itch.io page. I don't even know who this person is. That's all I have from them. So it made people feel gross. All right. And this is Don't Touch That Dial, which started out as a narrative game about driving in a car while changing the music on a radio dial. That turned into an interactive music synthesizer. By the way, there's a great free music synthesizer on Unity Asset Store. It's incredible. And then it was this, but also just royalty-free dubstep, just blasting. And so if you weren't making maximalist hell games, this is also what my colleague Elisa made, which were using the Noun project, which is a bunch of free available assets that are all black and white iconography. And so her theme of using different assets is obviously different. I just wanted to show this to show that you don't have to make the obnoxious games I make, that you can make things a little more like focused maybe. So yeah, that's all I really know about her games, or all I'm going to speak to about her games since I didn't make them. And that is it. You can find me on Twitter at Jack of Heart, and that is Cyberpunk, which I'm sure is it's not a good name. Anyway, all right, thank you so much.
One more round of applause for Jack Hart, who not only had the best bio, but the best shoes of the day. Our next talk is Turning the Ocean Orange with Jason Lee. Jason explores how design influences the way we play and how play interactions create narratives that we carry with us. His games focus on capturing the distance between what players intend versus what they actually. You can follow his thoughts on Twitter at Jason Zil, Z-I-L, and he keeps his track of video game job layoffs at Days Without Loss. Here's Jason.
Thank you. And for those of you who can't see Jack's amazing shoes, they are covered in googly eyes. So while you can't see them, they can definitely see you. Wait a second, Jordan, you said there was something here for me? Ah, perfect. This is what I need, right? No? To move slides. There's an on switch. Perfect. So originally the talk was titled Turning the Ocean Orange. After I developed it, it eventually took on this name, Flipping Your Game House, which is the way I'm going to describe this process that I think happened for the game Splatoon. If you're not familiar with it, Splatoon, and on the screen right now are gameplay images of Nintendo's Splatoon for the Wii U. Splatoon might be one of the decade's biggest surprise franchise creations. It certainly is Nintendo's biggest new hit among many 20-year-old franchises. Splatoon, the competitive shooter game, pits two teams against each other with a goal on a collision course. That one goal to cover the most amount of ground in the most amount of ink. It's known for its bright colors, stylish characters, and fashion choices, and of course for the wide use of ink throughout the game. I've always found a particular fascination with how this game managed to turn the traditional third-person shooter game, a genre known for having semi-realistic depictions of violence, into something that was relatively kid-friendly. Today, Splatoon is perhaps like the hottest franchise, right? With Splatoon 2, just 2 entries into this franchise, it is the 6th best-selling franchise on the Switch. It has the 3rd most amount of amiibo figures behind Mario and Animal Crossing. It has 17 for only 2 entries. It is the best-selling new IP in Japan since Wii Sports. The year it came out in 2015, this is its competition. These are not small games. Up on the screen right now are pictures of MGS5, Bloodborne, and The Witcher 3. Let's see, pardon me. So this 4-year-old franchise was competing with almost 40-year-old Mario and 20-year-old Animal Crossing for like the most popular Nintendo franchise right now. I mean, they had a concert, right? They had hologram characters giving a concert. This game is huge. I think that's incredible, and I wanted to know how they did this. How do you actually get to this point? And surely, if I could figure that out, I too can create something this big. And also, just for reference, the picture here is a camera footage off of the live stream from Nico Nico of the Callie and Mari hologram music concert for the game. Right. So I wanted to look at how they actually made this. I had my own personal theory. I don't think this is actually how they did it. This is a meme joke about traditional third-person shooters and the Inkling characters. So I took a more serious approach after this. I went to Nintendo themselves. In an interview that Satoru Iwata did with the developers of Splatoon, they said that in the beginning they weren't trying to create a new character, the Inkling character. They were trying to create a new game structure first and foremost. And I thought this was very fascinating. Because even though the character iconography of Splatoon is perhaps the most notable thing about it, they claimed they actually started with the game structure. And so they made it seem as though they cut Splatoon whole cloth from the ether. That's kind of the impression that I got from the way that they talk about it. So how exactly do we make a game structure? And, well, stop me if you heard this before. 100 of game devs walk into a room for 48 hours, and then one game walks out. That's essentially what happened for Splatoon. Many, many mini prototype sessions, and then the winner is this. On screen is the tofu prototype that they called of Splatoon for the Wii U. Relatively low resolution. This is it. Like, this is the thing that they've shown off at multiple different conferences since, and in their own talk at GDC. Let's see. So in this game, while I haven't actually been able to play it, I have studied what I can in order to give some takeaways for all of us to see how that we can get to this tofu prototype, this one thing that they started with to actually get there afterwards. So this is the thing that we got to study, right? So we've got to break down the tofu. It's a really kind of neat experiment to do to see a game that you have no access to, but actually bears a lot of similarities, I think, to things that we may have created on our own. So the first thing you'll notice in watching some of these footage is that you actually have low contrast. It's drab grayscale colors, don't really remind you of Splatoon at all. The flat maze layout of the levels aren't really inspiring any architectural imagination. The fixed camera behind the player is not really dynamic. There's no animations, no sound. It's difficult to see what you're actually aiming at. And speaking of aiming, you can't aim up or down at all in this version of the game. You can actually only turn left and right like a tank. It's almost Wolfenstein-like. And there's just this plain text UI that kind of just tells you, bomb ready, in capital letters. Perfect. Some further study of that footage reveals a couple strategies of how people are actually playing this game. You deal damage to opponents, ambush opponents, and cover new ground. And now, I was thinking to myself, wait a second, that's just a third-person shooter. You cannot lie to me, Nintendo. That is not a new game structure. So But honestly, this is where I think they started. I think they genuinely started at this point because I think the prototype came from a perspective of saying, I like third-person shooters, I wanted to make that. That's probably highly relatable to many game creators here. I like this, so I'm going to make something like it. And so it's not a new game structure. I think that's fine. I can't speak to the unknown and unseen prototypes, with which I'm sure there are many. But this reveals a far simpler origin for the Incredible Inklings. Simpler than inventing a whole new game, it was more like a mod, right? And I say that in a very positive way, because that's much more accessible to you and I than invent new game, right? That's much harder advice to follow than it is to say, take what you like and modify it. And so, for as much as I say about this, right, the tofu prototype takes the mechanical foundations of the original third-person shooter and manages to turn it into something else by doing a simple verb modification for how you interface with each other in shooting. This is just a brief breakdown of what it is. Instead of being able to shoot directly, you have a spray ability, and that has a few downstream effects, if you will. Pardon me. So I think what they did here really whoops, was to look at the third-person shooter as it already existed. Then they decided to really hold that structure in place, move the rooms around, and redecorate. And, well, I kind of revealed the joke already, but that's not creating a new thing. That's taking something established, flipping the foundations, and that's more like flipping a house, right? But once they changed it, right, Nintendo was able to really chase that twist. The spray mechanic as a twist on the basics of 3D-person gameplay really informed all of the decisions that they would do, right? It changed how they thought about the avatar, the theme, the aesthetics, the player experience, the rules. Nintendo themselves, in this GDC talk, have talked extensively about that process. They have said that the spray is what led them to create the Inklings, the ink guns, and the whole strange summer theming around the game is because of that spray, because you have water spray guns. And what I'd like to emphasize about this is that the tofu experiments actually allow you to fit that game into a broader narrative of designs beyond saying this is a new thing. It's actually just, you know, it's connected to Wolfenstein. It's connected to all these other games that you may have already experienced. And so this tofu prototype, your tofu prototype, is potentially in reach. And I think that simplicity of development is what allowed Splatoon to be a little bit more accessible, to other games in that area, right? Because it carries with it a degree of familiarity when you're actually physically playing that game. You don't need to learn an entirely new system of how to hold an interface with a controller. You just trade on the things that you already know from the popular games of the era. This worked to Splatoon's advantage. You don't have to learn you are using what you already have, and that's just a new house. You have a new room to play in using skills that you've already developed. That's the power I think that's available to you as people who are developing things on your own. In making games, I personally don't think it's reasonable that you come up with entirely brand new, never before seen play systems for your games. I don't really think there are that many to begin with. How many can wholly just pull that out? That's a 1 in a million type of situation, but I do think you are capable of taking current systems with a twist. I'm sure the creative experience is familiar to you. Make something you know and twist it. It's often the first game design lesson that you experience. And it's good enough to make one of the freshest franchises in the Nintendo quiver. You may not have the resources to chase your twists as far as Nintendo has. You can't make the custom music, the custom language, the custom clothing that Splatoon has. But you can do something that's within your own means of that same style. And in that sense, go find all of go find your own decrepit game houses and flip them, and then chase those twists. Like any house, a genre of game has a location with a cultural space, and flipping them has the ability to draw new people to it, much like Splatoon did. And that might be the most Splatoon lesson of all, which is stay fresh.
Thank you so much, Jason. I learned a lot about Splatoon just now. This game I never played. So our next speaker is Francesca Carletta Leon, With an introduction to soft circuits exploring e-textiles and wearable technology, Francesca is a game developer and educator whose work encompasses digital, tabletop, and alternative controller-style projects centered around themes of vulnerability, connection, and connections between players. She is the president of Contigo Games, curriculum director of Code Coven, and game designer at Filament Games. She loves plants, caffeinated tea, and her dog, Olive.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much. Yay. I realized too late that I did not put a photo of my dog in this presentation. I know, I'm so sorry. I'm just going to pull up my notes really quick, and then we're going to get started. All right, I'm going to navigate these two devices. Actually, if I put this up, then I can, never mind, it's fine. Okay, so we're going to be talking a little bit about e-textiles, soft circuits, and a little bit about alternative controllers, which there are some really good examples of in the expo hall if you haven't seen them yet. So hello, as a quick recap to that introduction. So my name is Francesca. My pronouns are she, her. So I'm the president and co-founder of Contigo Games, an indie studio that's centered around the idea of developing cooperative multiplayer experiences to bring players together and foster connection between players. I hold an MFA in game design from New York University, and I recently, about 2 weeks ago, so I'm brand new, started a job as a game designer at Filament Games, working on educational games. I'm also the curriculum director for Code Coven, and I also work sometimes with Girls Make Games. So I'm really passionate about teaching and helping people explore the awesomeness that is game development. So we're going to talk about soft circuits and electronics and all that cool stuff. So this is something that came into my life somewhat recently. And I think it's totally changed how I think about technology and how I think about game interfaces. So when we think of technology, we don't usually think of adjectives like flexible, soft, wearable. Electronic textiles, also known as smart garments, are fabrics which include electronic components. So like lights or sensors, and we can use this for game making. We can use this for alternative controllers, and we can use this to have the player be more embodied in game experiences. So I think like one day I would love to do this talk as a workshop, because I really feel like the great thing about working this way is that really just like interacting with the materials and building and being very creative with this craft. So we're going to start with some examples of what soft circuits are, so we're all sort of on the same page. So just going through some of them, like this is an example of e-textiles being used as fashion. Did you know you can 3D print fabric or 3D print onto fabric? You can also include like sensors, wiring, lights, all of these cool things to make really interesting garments. Another purpose, so this is like tattoos, which are just, they look really cool. But the one on the right here is actually being used to monitor a patient's temperature, so that it also has health applications. So in this example, they're using conductive ink to actually create a circuit on the patient's body, and then they're able to apply the sensor, right? That blew my mind. I think it's the coolest thing. The next one is, this is an example of it being used for like safety purposes, right? Like indicators on cyclists, right? So this is another very practical application of how we could be using electronic garments in everyday life. And I'm not going to show the video for this, but I really recommend checking it out. This is like an e-textiles project that is used for art creation. So they put these sensors on a ballerina's shoes, and by performing a dance, they're able to create 2D images and art, which is incredibly interesting. And the big one that I want to talk about that I've primarily been working with is alternative controllers. So how do we make games that use this craft to make a gameplay experience better or more interesting. So these are two projects by Kaho Abe. So Kaho Abe is a really fantastic developer and works a lot with costumes as controllers for interaction. So these are both games that don't use a screen at all, and they're very gesture based. So you're performing gestures and you're interacting with a partner in certain ways. So there's touch involved, there's movement involved, and really your whole body becomes this like controller that you're playing with and experimenting with, and it's also a bit performative as well. I'm also not going to show this video, but this is a project that I worked on, one of the first ones that I did in sort of this costumes as controller space. But this is a game we called Shark Attack. So the idea is that one player is chosen as the attacker, and then they have to like bite the other players. So we made these little like conductive mittens of sharks. And like it seems like, oh, there's all this intricate electronics or things going on backstage, but it's really just that we're using conductive fabric and we're creating circuits. So when you touch another player, you're completing a circuit, and then we're able to communicate that back to an Arduino that's keeping track of things. So this was a really interesting project where I got to see how alternative controllers can make you very playful, and it can be about exploring how you interact in real space with other people, which is something I became very interested in. The other thing is that I wanted to talk a little bit about like the types of soft sensors that you can build. This is also something that I found out about somewhat recently, and it completely blew my mind. Did you know that you can crochet a sensor? An electronic sensor. That's so cool. Yeah, I think it's amazing. This is an example of like silly putty, like conductive silly putty being used as a stretch sensor. So as you're stretching it, you're changing the amount of electricity that is moving through it, and like the Arduino or whatever sort of like receiving end you're using is able to sense that. And I just think that's really incredible. These different things that can be soft and flexible, and we can use this for unique interactions. Yeah, so I think that's just, it's really neat. So you can buy like conductive thread, conductive fabric, paint, ink, yarn, all of these different things that you basically do like arts and crafts and make electronics projects. So this is an Arduino, so I use, oh, I didn't change the slide. This is an Arduino, which I use for most of my alternative controller projects. So basically it's like a tiny little adorable computer. They're about this big, and they look a little complicated and intimidating, but now I just think they're like the most adorable, cutest thing. And so this is a really great way to make small interactions and like small games using alternative controllers. So all of your code can run on the Arduino. Zoop. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about a game that you might have seen because it's here in the expo hall. I'm going to talk about Hell Couch, which is a project that I've been working on for about a year now, and we've taken it to this is our 4th Hell Couch here at PixelPop, and people have been really enjoying it. So I wanted to talk a little bit about like what actually makes a Hell Couch. So this is a game where there's no screen. It's all about movement. So yeah, what is this thing that is strange and I haven't seen it before? So it's a game where demons drive out with brain and buttocks, and it requires full physical effort, especially from your butt. Thank you. My lovely collaborator, Carol, is also here. So yeah, this is something that people are really excited about. It's, I think, for most people, the only game they've encountered that you play exclusively with your butt. And because of that, it just immediately becomes this like playful, eccentric experience that anyone can sit down and try. Literally sit down and try. So yeah, what goes into making a Hell Couch? I'm going to show a little bit of like actually what is like not under the hood, under the couch. But yeah, so what are the electronics that go into making something like an installation project like this work? So here's a picture. It doesn't look terribly complicated, actually. I think people assume there's a lot more complexity going on than there actually is. So here are the pieces that we have. So we've got some wires, some LED light strips that we store by, and a couch. That's a very important part of this project. You have to have a couch. Time is up. I'm going to talk really, really fast. Conductive tape and a couple other things, but we actually home make our pressure sensors. They're made out of like craft foam and like conductive tape, and lots and lots of hot glue. It honestly feels much more like arts and crafts than it does anything else. So I'm going to go through really, really fast. So ultimately this game is about the experience that you're designing and how the player embodiment changes the experience they're having and ultimately improves it so that they're having like an ideal, interesting experience. I honestly think that Hell Couch is essentially a game that it's 3 buttons, but because it has this alternative controller aspect, it becomes unique and engaging and playful in a way that it wouldn't have otherwise. And I'm going to skip to the end really quick. These are all resources, and if you would like them, please come chat with me and I'll talk your ear off about alternative controller things. So the last thing that I just wanted to mention is that like electronics may seem very intimidating. I didn't get started with them until recently because I thought it was something I didn't know how to do or I couldn't do for whatever reason. But I think like it's important that we reframe how we think about technology, what it's for, who's building it, and ultimately I want to encourage everyone to think of technology as being playful and hardware as potentially being soft. Thank you.
Sorry. So, our next and final talk for day 1 of PixelPop is from Ebeth Norvell, sorry.
That's cool.
Cuddle Up with Cozy Games. Ebeth Norvell is a game designer who believes in small games, accessible tools, and playing music for plants. They have a BA in Interactive Design and Game Development from Savannah College of Art and Design in 2018. Some of their games include Slow Growing, Morning Mushrooms, and the Bitsy Jim Jam. That sounds fun. You can find more about them at electronicbeth and ebethnorvell.com. Here's Ebeth.
Hi. Okay, so my talk is called Cozy Games Are Cool and Good, and maybe you should make them if you want to. No pressure. Wait, sorry, I'm just going to get a timer going here, so like... Okay, cool. Okay, so I'm Ebeth, they, them pronouns. Yeah, I make small games. The most important thing here as relevant fun facts is that my body is a trash fire. I have an autoimmune disorder. I'm very frequently sick. I very frequently cannot do things that I want to do because I have to control my stress levels and my physical levels of like overexerting myself. So the kind of takeaway from my body being a trash fire is that I really like cozy games. I love angry, loud games too, but a lot of times when I'm sick, I want to play something that's going to be comfortable and healing for me. So this talk about cozy games, I'm not going to be really talking much about the visual aesthetics because I think that's pretty obvious and also would vary from culture to culture and is the least interesting thing about cozy games. I'm going to be talking more about the mechanics. So I think the sort of basics of any cozy game are warmth, healing, vulnerability, intimacy, and those two kind of go hand in hand. Safety, mundanity, and they're kind of meditative. So like Wilmot's Warehouse, which just came out recently, maybe isn't the most like cozy aesthetics that you would immediately think of, but it's a very cozy game because it's very like repetitive, you're allowed to organize, you're given time afterwards. It's a very simple thing. A lot of cozy games are also very ritualistic, I feel like. Cozy moments are often very simple. It's just like making tea or something like sewing where it's a repetitive task. It's kind of this idea of you're in this huge crazy world, but you're given this moment where you know you're safe and you're allowed to do some simple thing without any demands made of you. Okay, so this is my weird thesis for this, is that cozy games are like libraries, because a lot of games, want you to be productive in them, and that's sort of a, I think, side effect of our capitalistic society. And like libraries are just places where you're allowed to go and kind of do whatever, and you're given a lot of resources, but there's not really any expectations of you there, and they're not demanding money from you. They're not demanding like productivity of you. I mean, a lot of people go to the library to be productive, but like that's not the point of them. So for mechanics, for cozy games, like focusing on small stuff, letting the world exist without the player, I think is really important. If your game is centering around the player and the protagonist is the most important thing in the world, then it can't really be super cozy because they're never given this sort of secluded moment. It's just always like on. Let the player go at their own pace. Don't overwhelm the player with a whole lot of stuff. And this is also, I think, important for if you're doing a cozy game. Think about like colors on the screen or audio for stuff that can be like very overstimulating. Non-transactional interactions, allowing the player to exist in the world, like just sit under a tree and they get a nice view, but they're not like leveling up. Or they can talk to NPCs, but they're not just leveling up the hearts of the NPCs, they're just getting to know them. Like, not every interaction that you have in a game needs to be rewarding you with something that's gonna like give you more, which is kind of like the productivity and like capitalistic aspect of a lot of games. So tend and befriend is, instead of fight or flight, focus on forming interactions in the game that are about befriending people or taking care of each other. And this is more for multiplayer games too. This one's kind of obvious: no intrusive ads or microtransactions. Like Animal Crossing, like all the previous games are super cozy, and then Pocket Camp is really not. It's because they're trying to get you to buy leaf tickets like every 5 minutes, and it's like, please go away. Okay, so digital intimacy. This image up here, which should have been a GIF, but then I saved it as a PDF, and then just now I'm realizing it's not going to be GIF anyway. This is from the Bitsy Gym Jam, and what that was a collaboration in the Bitsy community. A lot of us live really far away from each other, and we're like, oh dang, what if we could have a sleepover? And I was like, virtual sleepover time. So everyone just submitted a sprite with dialogue and some items, and then the end result was a virtual sleepover. So that's sort of the final point here of like, get creative. So if you're doing multiplayer games or any sort of thing like that, with cozy games, it's good to foster communities. You need to allow players to set boundaries, and this kind of goes along with the non-verbal communication is good. Like in Journey and the Endless Forest, you can't type anything, but you still form these really deep bonds with people, and it's partially because you have to be creative with how you're talking to people. But also in the Endless Forest, you are allowed to have emotes that say like, hey, I don't want you here. And you need to allow players to set boundaries because you can't force intimacy and vulnerability. It grows with the community with time. And if you're not doing a cozy multiplayer game, you need heavy moderation. Now, Minecraft can be completely chaotic, or it can be this really sweet, wonderful thing, and the Bitsy Minecraft community, sorry, I'm bringing up Bitsy again, is really, really nice. When I joined it, I had never played Minecraft before, and everyone was like, here's all my resources, and people were like leading me around the map, showing me how to do stuff. But we had some people come into it who started being disruptive, started trying to take stuff from people, and they had to get kicked out immediately. So the kind of takeaway from that is that if you're going to have a game with nonverbal communication or any that's multiplayer, you need to have a good moderation team and a good system set up for complaints, because just because you have a cozy aesthetic or you're like, this is a nice game, come and be nice, people are going to try to abuse that for shits and giggles. Like, it's just going to happen. It sucks. Anyway. Okay, so why to make Why make cozy games? To create validating, healing experiences for players, to encourage community, growth, and creativity, to create communities that set healthy boundaries and support each other, to provide care and safe spaces for people, to encourage meditation and mindfulness, and to celebrate the little things. And so, because in a world obsessed with productivity and competition, creating safe and cozy spaces is a wonderful thing. Okay, thank you for listening. These are like things I was looking at while I was writing this. I'll post them on my Twitter. That's Electronic Beth. I probably won't post them for like a couple hours because I'm really hungry and I'm gonna go eat after this. Okay, thank you. And thank you to everyone at PixelPop for organizing this, and happy PixelPop Day 1!
Thank you so much, everyone. If you weren't here for the opening remarks, I am Carol Mertz. I am the executive director and co-founder of PixelPop Festival. Thank you all so much for being here on day 1 of PixelPop 2019. That wraps it up. Woo! We heard some really amazing talks on all kinds of subject matter, incredibly important, and we're just so excited for what's in store for tomorrow. We hope you all join us at our after party this evening from 7 to 10 p.m. at Earthbound Brewing, although we just found out there's a street fair happening right in front, so be prepared for bad parking and please carpool. But there will be free food and a cash bar, so come enjoy some rice bowls with us and buy yourself a beer and come hang out. And otherwise, we will all see you tomorrow. The show floor tomorrow is going to open at 10 a.m. and the first talk is going to start here in this same room at 11 a.m. Really quick, I would like to thank our sponsors. The SLU Chaffetz Center for Entrepreneurship provides this space for us, so let's give them a huge round of applause. And our featured sponsor, Riot Games, and our main stage sponsor, NYU Game Center, have made this amazing conference session series possible. So let's give them a huge round of applause, too. Thank you. And I would also like to give a special thank you to Jordan Jones-Brewster, who has been our MC for the day. Fantastic. So again, thank you all so much, and we will see you at 7 p.m. at Earthbound. And if we don't see you at 7 p.m. at Earthbound, hopefully we'll see you at 10 a.m. tomorrow in the Expo Hall. Thank you so much. Have a great weekend.